directly to the disciples that at that time won't apply to them. It will be more relevant for Matthew, who wrote this gospel, for his church and his community of faith. Because the Gospels don't begin to be written until after that first generations of Christians is dying off, to be written as a way of preserving the teachings of Jesus for the next generation. And Jesus has very specific practical advice. If there is a dispute between two people, then you go to that one person, and the two people are to talk in isolation about their grievances. If then the person is won over, then you've won back your brother or your sister. If not, then take back two witnesses who can make notes and offer objective counsel. And if that still doesn't work, then invite this person to come before the entire church. And if the person is still not willing to concede, then treat that person as you would the Gentiles or the tax collectors. There's a lot of practical wisdom that's found within this advice. One of the first ones is that people who are in conflict with each other should sit down and talk face to face. It is the best way to try to overcome conflict. And unfortunately, it tends to be the last option that church people choose. Church people are not good about sitting down with each other when they have a dispute. In part because none of us really likes conflict. Also because some people feel like if we engage in conflict in the church, we're not doing what we're supposed to be about, because that's not the kind of thing that church people do. There are other motivations as well, too. Suppose in a church, Mr. Adams has a dispute with Mrs. Brinson. They may be arguing about something, but Mr. Adams doesn't want to alienate Mrs. Brinson too much, because when the chips are down and he needs help, he knows Mrs. Brinson will be there for him. So other tactics are then engaged upon as a way of not dealing with conflict directly. One of the popular ones is Mr. Adams has his own group of friends, and he talks and he vents to people about what Mrs. Brinson is doing, in hopes that maybe this will create some sort of a cultural climate to change that. But Mrs. Brinson has friends too, and she gathers and she talks with her friends about what Mr. Adams has done. Or the other popular method, if Mr. Adams doesn't want to deal with this directly, is for Mr. Adams to go into the pastor's office and to say, Pastor, Mrs. Brinson is doing some things that should concern you, and I really think it would be in the best interest of the church if you could sit down and talk with her. And church life being the way it is, 2 days later, usually Mrs. Brinson comes into the pastor's office and says, you need to know about what Mr. Adams is doing, and maybe you need to go and deal with it. Jesus is giving us this advice, even before the church has begun, that when there is a dispute among two people, have those two people sit down and talk directly. There are a million different ways that we can avoid conflict, including the ones I've just mentioned. But when we do that, we only make the matter more harmful in the long run. I'm struck by the starkness of the language that Jesus uses. I'm using dispute or conflict because it's sort of a milder term. But the term that Jesus actually uses is if someone sins against you. Sin is a harsher term. All of those things that we read about in the Romans passage this morning, that talks about sinful behavior, the kind that can wreak violence on a church community. It's ironic because when I think about the reasons church people fight, it tends to be something much more minor, like the furnishings in the parlor, the way we're trimming the shrubbery out front, or moving that picture down the hall so we can put something else on the wall there. If any of this sounds familiar to you, it's not because I'm telling you anything you don't know. It's just because every church has this kind of content. And if we're not aware of it, we're just not paying attention. And Jesus goes on to say that if the two people sitting down isn't able to reach the dispute, then bring other witnesses in to hear and to clarify and to record. Keeping in mind that what Jesus is talking about here is sinning against someone else. If you and I have a dispute that we just can't let go, and it seems pretty minor, maybe we need to pray about that. Because what it is that has us so fried isn't really a sin that we need to be combating. Objective witnesses can do that. They can listen and reflect what they're hearing and help us to kind of engage and do a little soul searching on our own. This passage is easily misinterpreted. I've known people in church settings who take this to mean, if I have a dispute with someone else, then I gang up on him. And if I don't get my way and he concedes, I run him out of the church. That's not what Jesus is saying here. These other witnesses come in and they listen so they can offer clarification. They can sit down with Mr. Adams and Mrs. Brinson and say, well, Mr. Adams, you seem to have a genuine grievance, but so does Mrs. Brinson. And it seems like maybe you are both doing things that are complicating this issue further. That's the way that this is supposed to work initially. Dr. John Savage is a United Methodist elder and a psychologist who has worked with conflict mediation with churches. And he wrote a wonderful little book that I would recommend to you called Caring and Listening Skills. It's a way to talk and to listen to other people, not just hearing specifically what's said, but the emotions that lie under it. He points out that oftentimes what frustrates people in church squabbles isn't just that what I want isn't being done, but I don't feel like I'm being listened to. I don't feel like I'm being held and considered important. Dr. Savage lays out a particular pattern that takes what Jesus said and other teachings in Scripture to mediate conflict in the church and to prevent it from happening in the first place. To suggest and to allow people to sit down face to face and to teach them tools to how to talk about things that might be uncomfortable in a way that can be constructive and helpful. He's done mediation work with a number of churches. Some churches have been completely turned around. Others were so far gone that they were already disintegrating from within. And there are some churches that were so profoundly touched by his work, they've asked every member of the church to take a course that's accompanied with this Caring and Listening Skills book. And anybody who wanted to join the church had to go through that as well. Recognizing that if you want to be a part of this body, we have to know and learn how to talk to one another respectfully and lovingly so that we can be constructive and focus instead on sharing the gospel. Dr. Savage was counseling a Presbyterian church which had a similar physical makeup to ours, where they had a main church building with a sanctuary and a separate facility that had a gymnasium that they used not only for recreational events, but also for weekly meals. And in the Presbyterian church, elders are lay leaders. They are laity who play certain leadership roles in the church. And in this church, they had a weekly fellowship meal every Wednesday night. And they would set up one half of the gymnasium for this meal, and the other half would be not set up so that youth could come in and play basketball. And in some cases, they were youth who were a part of the church and a part of the family. But also there were others who were encouraged to come in and visit, and through that, reach out to their families as well. It was a wonderful way of fellowship and recreation that went on hand in hand every week. But there were problems that occurred. Whenever the youth were playing basketball, inevitably a ball would fall out of bounds and bounce off the table. And there was one member who got particularly infuriated by that. and he would pick up the ball, and he would go and he would grab a youth by the arm. And there in the gym, he would curse them out using very foul language. And this happened every single week. And it made people uncomfortable. But being a church environment, no one wanted to confront this man about that. And after a while, people began to be uncomfortable because of the toxic environment that was created. And pretty soon, families and people that had youth started staying away and not wanting to go because they didn't want to be a part of that. Well, there are different options that they could have handled. They could have talked with each other behind this man's back, which is what they were doing. But that didn't solve the problem. Someone could have gone to the pastor of that church and say, "Pastor, maybe you can talk with this man." But that would have resulted in one of two things happening. It's a Presbyterian church, so the man who is guilty of doing this particular violent act would have likely gotten his friends together and over time convinced people that they needed a change in pastoral leadership. Or the other thing that could have happened is the man could have been embarrassed, stopped his behavior for the time, but when that pastor left, the behavior just picks up and continues again. So Dr. Savage said to them, "You realize this man is your friend. He is your neighbor. You have known him for many years. And if you, the elders and leaders of this church, confront him, that will bring him into it." So finally one night they were gathered there for their fellowship meal. And their youth were playing basketball, and a ball hit this man's table. And he got up and started to go and rebuke the youth. But immediately, very firmly, but very gently, 4 elders surrounded this man. And they called him by name and they said, "What you are doing is not appropriate. We know you mean well, but it's causing more harm than good. And your behavior is not fitting for church. And if you ever do that again, 4 elders will surround you and quietly escort you out the building." And with that, it came to an end. They followed Jesus' advice, and they confronted this man directly. Dealing with conflict in the church is always going to be hard and always unpleasant. And frequently, and most of the time, in fact, it is gentle work. There is something about being rebuked from someone we know and love for years that means more to us than being rebuked by a stranger. And that is the work that Jesus is calling us to do. The last verse of this passage is particularly chilling. It's a well-known verse to us, where Jesus says, "When 2 or 3 gather, there I am among you." That's one of these verses that we love to throw out when attendance to a prayer group or Bible study is a little less than what we'd expected. Well, only a few people showed up, but remember what Jesus said. But consider that this particular verse is in a passage where Jesus is talking about church conflict. Jesus said, if you are not able to reconcile the one who has sinned against the congregation, you are to treat them like Gentiles or like tax collectors. Those were people in that particular time in society who would have been outside of the congregation and the fellowship. But let's consider from the Gospels how Jesus reacts to tax collectors and to Gentiles. This morning in the tween class, we were looking at the story of Zacchaeus. And he ate in Zacchaeus' home and allowed Zacchaeus to serve him. And he treated him respectfully and lovingly, and Zacchaeus' life was changed. The tax collectors and the Gentiles were people whom Jesus loved, and he healed, and he dined with them. Sometimes we might have to take somebody out of a leadership position or call somebody with a harsh word when someone was acting in a way that does violence to the congregation. But we continue to love them. We continue to forgive them. We continue to consider them a part of the community of faith. Immediately following this passage, there's an exchange between Peter and Jesus, where Peter asks Jesus, how many times should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7? No, not 7, but 70 times 7. This is not about ganging up and driving someone out who gets on our nerves. This is about congregational care and tough love that we have with each other. Jesus is saying that in the midst of this hard and gentle work, there I am among you. It is the work of God's people. It is the work of a church that wants to be productive and healthy. And it is the work that Christ is always there doing with us. Amen.